watching Big Brain Energy.
Kia ora koutou. This is the final part of the 2025 NCEA 3.1 paper on market equilibrium. If you haven't checked out the first two videos, you might want to check those out because we go over in depth question 1 and 2. So let's crack straight into question 3. Question 3 is all about subsidies. It says, subsidies play an important role in improving New Zealanders' access to affordable and effective medicines. Without a subsidy, the market for medicines is likely to face a shortage. So medicines is a great example of something that we have subsidies on in real life in New Zealand. If you're a New Zealander and you need some medicine, it's really, really cheap. Often it's free, or sometimes it is $5 to get a prescription, since the government has recently enacted that law. But either way, it's really cheap to get medicine in New Zealand. Because the government pays for the medicine, they pay a subsidy. Okay, so this question is saying, for question AI on graph 4 above, use the dotted lines to show the resulting shortage of medicines that might occur at price P1. Label the shortage and the corresponding QD and QS. So this question is saying, before the subsidy gets imposed, if the price was P1, then this will probably result in a shortage. Why is that? Show it on the graph. Okay, so where the P1 dotted line intersects the supply curve gives us the quantity supplied. We draw a dotted line down and that gives us the quantity supplied at this P1 price. Basically, pharmacies don't want to sell that much medicine at P1 because it's not very profitable. The price is pretty low. So there's not a lot that is supplied. Quantity supplied is fairly small. Whereas if we follow the dotted line out to where it hits the demand curve and draw a dotted line down, that gives us the quantity demanded. So at this price, a low price, people would want QD amount of medicine, which is fairly high because it's cheap, so you'd want it, right? So you can see that QD is more than QS. So that's saying that people want a lot of medicine, but suppliers aren't providing much medicine. So therefore, there is a shortage. There isn't enough medicine to meet the demand. So the distance between QD and QS is going to be the shortage. Question AII says the current price is P1. How would equilibrium be restored in this market for medicine? In your answer, refer to the relevant labels on graph 4. The changes that you made in part AI above and the concept of market forces. Now, this is a very classic question that you're given in the exam. Either there's going to be a shortage or a surplus, and you have to talk about how equilibrium is restored. So it would be worthwhile memorizing a model answer for these types of questions. Alright, so at the current price, which is P1, the quantity demanded, which is QD of medicines, is greater than the quantity supplied, QS, resulting in a shortage. So remember to refer back to the graph here by saying QD and QS. When there is a shortage, people want to buy the medicines, but there is not enough medicine to go around. So there's going to be a bit of a war going on to make sure that people get the medicine that they want. So this is when consumers what is called bid up the price of medicines. Bidding up is the term that we use to say that there's a bit of a scrap going on. Everyone wants medicine, so they're willing to pay a high price. They bid up the price. As the price rises, producers think, oh, it's a bit more profitable for me to sell medicines, so I'm going to sell more. So as the price rises, producers wish to increase the quantity supplied because selling medicines becomes more profitable. So QS would increase. Also, as the price increases, some consumers will be driven out of the market because medicines become less affordable. So if medicine is more expensive, then some people can't afford it. So therefore, quantity demanded would decrease. So quantity supplied continues increasing and quantity demanded continues to decrease until the equilibrium is met where QD equals QS. So that is going to be at PE and QE on the graph, the new equilibrium. And this is what happens in real life. This is how prices changed based on supply and demand. This type of thing happens over a long period of time though, not just like in one day. And it's always fairly rough. So the equilibrium price in real life is kind of vague. It's a price that they're aiming towards, but it's not always fixed at exactly that price, right? Because this is all very theory-based. It's not exactly what happens in real life. It's just roughly, this is kind of the thing that happens. Great, let's look at part 2 now. This says better health outcomes for New Zealanders would now mean less cost pressure on the health system in the long term. This is a good justification for the government to continue subsidising the medicine. On graph 4, you have to draw in a new curve to show the effect of a subsidy that would remove the shortage from the market, and label that curve. And then shade and label the area that represents the total cost of the subsidy to the government, and then show the price that producers receive after the subsidy labelled PP. And then lastly, mark the area representing the deadweight loss with the letters A, B, and C. So let's start with drawing in the subsidy curve. A subsidy curve is a line which is parallel to the supply curve, and it is on the supply curve's right. We label that subsidy. So it asks us to draw in the subsidy curve so that the quantity being brought is going to be equal to QD, because that rectifies the shortage. So you need to draw in the subsidy curve where it intersects that QD dotted line. So then now the quantity that is being sold and brought is going to be QD. The price that consumers pay for medicine is going to be where that subsidy curve intersects the demand curve, which gives us P1. To get the price that producers receive, you will follow that QD dotted line. Then you have to go all the way up to where it hits the supply curve and then across to the price axis. We label this PP, and this is the price that the producers receive. The reason for this is because the subsidy goes partly towards the consumers and then partly towards the producers. So the pharmacies and other medicine providers, they are subsidised by the government as well to ensure that they can supply the medicines at appropriate cost. So that's why the cost decreases for consumers, and at the same time, the price that producers receive increases because they get to keep some of that subsidy. If some of this is a bit fuzzy, check out our video where we cover in depth the subsidy graph, linked down below. Alright, so let's shade and label the area that represents the total cost of the subsidy to the government. The total cost of the subsidy would be the difference between what consumers pay and the price that producers receive. Basically, the government is like topping up the extra amount. So PP is the price that producers receive, PC is the amount that the consumers pay. So then the difference between them would be the cost of the subsidy, the amount that the government tops up. And then it goes all the way out to QD, which is a quantity that has been sold. Deadweight loss is going to be this triangle here, marked by A, B, C. This is the potential that could have been gained, but isn't being gained by anyone. So the government is paying this whole box, which includes the deadweight loss triangle, because this part of the subsidy isn't going towards anyone. The consumer and producer surpluses don't cover that portion of the subsidy, but it is being paid for. So therefore, it is deadweight loss. It is potential that could have been gained, but isn't. We talk a bit more about this in our video of the subsidy graph, so check that out. Awesome. All right, so that's all the graphing questions. Now for question B, we have to refer to the graph and the resource material to explain the impact on the subsidy of the market for medicines on consumers, producers, the government, and allocative efficiency. So consumers like subsidies because it means that they don't have to pay as much for something, which means that they can buy more. So we can say that when there is a subsidy on medicines, consumers are better off. Consumer surplus increases by PE, BC, P1. It increases because the price that they pay decreases on the graph. It decreases from PE to PC, and then the amount that they buy increases from QE to QD. So if they get to buy more stuff and they get to buy it for cheaper, then they like that. So consumer surplus increases. Now, we covered this in the last two videos in this series, but there is a sentence that you need to say in this exam to get excellence when you are describing the impact on a surplus. And that sentence is, this means that the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and what they actually pay increases, and there are more units from which to gain a surplus. So what this is saying is that the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and what they actually pay, so that was the consumer surplus definition, that increases. So you're just saying consumer surplus increases. And there are more units from which to gain a surplus, which means that quantity is increasing. If they buy more stuff, then there's more opportunity for them to benefit. So there are more units, there are more things that they could buy from which they have the opportunity to benefit to gain a surplus. And then we'll include a concluding sentence, hence consumers are better off and consumer surplus increases and they have better access to medicine. So make sure you always link it back to what the question is actually talking about, medicine. And that's part of the marking criteria. It says in the question, refer to the resource material, so make sure you actually link it back to what you're actually talking about. Awesome, and then let's look at producers. Now, producers also like subsidies. Remember, subsidies don't just go towards consumers, they also benefit the producers. So the price that producers receive increases. So subsidies partly go towards consumers, and they also go partly towards offsetting the cost for producers. So we can say that when there is a subsidy on medicines, producers are better off. Producer surplus increases by PE, PP, A, B, because the price producers receive increases from PE to PP, and the amount that they sell increases from QE to QD. This means that the difference between what producers are willing to sell for and what they actually sell for increases, and there are more units from which to gain a surplus. Hence, when there is a subsidy, producers are better off and producer surplus increases. It becomes more profitable to sell medicines. So this format should look pretty similar to the consumer's answer. It's basically the same thing, you just change the keywords. And in fact, you'll notice that this answer is basically the same as the answers we gave for the tariff question in the last video. So whenever they ask you about the impact on consumers, producers, the government, or allocative efficiency, you can answer it in this very structured sample answer kind of way and just change the keywords. So that makes it really easy to remember how to structure your answers. Basically, you say, are they better off or worse off? And then you say, what happens to the surpluses? Does it increase or decrease? And by how much on the graph? And then you say, what happens to price? What happens to quantity? Linking it back to the graph. And then you say that sentence, the difference between what they're willing to sell and what they actually sell for, and the units from which to gain a surplus. And then some kind of concluding sentence, just to make sure that you actually answered the question, linking it to the resource material. So the next question is about the government. A typical format that they ask is that they ask all four of these parties, consumers, producers, the government, and allocative efficiency, and then one of them they ask you something a little bit more specific. So in this question they've asked, including how it justifies the continued funding of medicine subsidies despite funding pressures so that the government has to pay the subsidy. So that's saying the government has to pay the subsidy, and how can we justify them paying that subsidy? So let's first talk about the impact on the government. When there is a subsidy, the government is worse off because they must pay for the subsidy, which is the shaded area on the graph. This means that the government has less money to spend on other projects, for example, infrastructure or healthcare. When you talk about what the government spends money on, it's good to include a few examples there, because often in the marking schedules, I don't know why, but they like you to have some examples of other things that they could spend the money on. So here we've got some examples: education, infrastructure, and healthcare. So the government has to pay for a subsidy for the medicines. You can't just get the medicines for free, the government is paying for it, so therefore they are worse off. However, the government will also achieve its goals of allowing people to purchase medicines more affordably. So yes, it costs them some money, but the government does also have, theoretically at least, our best interest in heart. So they are trying to ensure that we can afford medicines. So they have achieved that goal. This means that there will be better health outcomes for New Zealanders because they have better access to medicines. So there will be fewer people needing healthcare. Now, if there are fewer people needing healthcare, then this could justify the cost, the short-term cost of funding medicines, because the long-term benefits of the subsidy is that less people need major health cares, so that could justify the short-term cost of subsidising medicines. Great, and then the last question is all about allocative efficiency. So before the subsidy, the market for medicines was allocatively efficient because the consumer and producer surpluses were maximised and there was no deadweight loss. But when the subsidy gets added, consumer surplus increases and producer surplus increases. However, those increases do not outweigh the cost of the subsidy to the government, as indicated by the deadweight loss, which is area A, B, C. Basically, yes, subsidies benefit consumers and yes, they benefit producers, but those benefits are not outweighed by the cost to the government. The cost to the government is bigger than the extra benefit to consumers and producers. So therefore, there is some deadweight loss. On the graph, the increase in consumer and producer surplus is less than that whole box that is the cost to the government. So therefore, there is some deadweight loss, which is area A, B, C. Hence, when there is a subsidy, the market is not allocatively efficient. Now, this is a sentence that they like you to include for excellence. Total surpluses are not maximised, and hence there is a net welfare loss. So that means people aren't benefiting as much as they possibly could be because there is some deadweight loss. And the net welfare loss means that overall there is a net welfare loss to society. So overall the cost is more than the benefit. Although remember that this is just looking at the short term, we're not looking about other aspects which could be beneficial, like the long-term impact on healthcare. Alright, so that was everything for this answer. Let's have a look now at the marking schedule to see how our answer compares and what you need to do to get the grade that you want. So for the first page, on the graph questions, you just need to identify and label QS and QD in the shortage. So we've done that, so that gives us achieve. For the explanation question, there is a sample answer there of the things that you could say. You need to include for achieved 3 things. For merit, you need to include 4 things, and to get excellence, you need to include all of them. So looking at excellence, which has all of the bullet points, we have to say that there is a shortage created at price P1 as quantity demanded is more than quantity supplied. So that symbol in between QD and QS is the greater than symbol. So it's saying that people want more than there is available, so therefore there is a shortage. And then you need to say that consumers bid up the price to secure quantity wanted. So bidding up the price is a technical term that you need to use, although it doesn't sound very technical. But this is the way that economists describe how consumers are demanding so much and there isn't enough available, so they're willing to pay a higher price. And then we say that quantity demanded decreases as it becomes less affordable. And then we say that quantity supplied increases as it becomes more profitable. So note that you don't just say quantity demanded or quantity increases or decreases, but you say why as well. And then you say that the equilibrium is restored where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied at the equilibrium price PE and equilibrium quantity QE. The equilibrium is where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, and it's where you have PE and QE. Note, something important here is that every time we say quantity demanded or quantity supplied, make sure you include that word quantity and you don't just say demand or supply. Demand and supply refers to something else. It refers to the demand curve and the supply curve. Whereas quantity demanded and quantity supplied refers to where those curves hit the quantity axis. So those are 2 separate things. So make sure if you're talking about how quantity changes on the axis, then you talk about quantity demanded and quantity supplied. Or if you're talking about the whole curve shifting left or right, then that would be demand or supply changing. And then for excellence, you also have to make sure that your explanation is in the context of the market for medicines. So make sure that you actually link it back to what you're talking about. So now let's look at how the subsidy impacts consumers, producers, and the government and allocative efficiency. So to get achieved, you actually only have to explain one thing. You have to explain, does it increase or decrease due to the change in price or a change in quantity? To get merit, you have to add in a little bit more detail. So you say that it changes because of price and because of quantity. Let's have a bigger look at the excellence answer. So for consumer surplus, you need to say that the subsidy benefits consumers and consumer surplus increases. So you say 1, it benefits consumers, and 2, consumer surplus increases due to the lower price and higher quantity. So there is increased access to medicine, which means more units from which to gain a surplus, or you can say that the difference between the price paid and the price consumers are willing to pay increases. So you actually only have to include one of those things for excellence, but often they like you to include both, so it's good to just include both just in case the marking schedule wants you to. For producers, it's going to be the same thing, just from the producer's perspective. Looking at the government, you need to say that the subsidy will cost the government, so that makes him worse off, which means that spending in other sectors decreases. And you see that they've got some examples in brackets there, so make sure you include some examples as well. I know they don't really mention it in the question to say that you have to do that, but whenever you talk about government spending in other sectors, just include a couple of examples, because they like that in the schedule. Or they could increase debt. So we didn't actually mention that, but that is another way that you could write it. Instead of spending less, they could just borrow more. And then you also say that the subsidy will improve health outcomes, so less pressure on the health system in the long term justifies the funding of the subsidy. So that's what we were talking about there when we say the short-term cost might be outweighed by the long-term benefit. And then lastly, for allocative efficiency, you say that there will be a loss of allocative efficiency due to the deadweight loss created, as the combined gain in consumer surplus and producer surplus is outweighed by the cost to the government. So you have to have that offsetting idea. So you have to compare the increase and the decreases, and then the overall increase in consumer and producer surplus is less than the overall decrease from the cost to the government. So you compare both the benefits and the cost, and you say which one is bigger. And then you also say, this was that sentence at the end where we wrote that they like you to include for excellence, you say surpluses are not maximised and there is net welfare loss. And then you have to make sure that you refer both to the graph and the resource material. So you refer to the graph when you talk about changes like QE to Q1, and then you also refer to the resource material. So you talk about medicines. Alrighty, so that was everything for this last question in the 2025 paper. If you've been following along all 3 videos, let us know in the comments below. You can also let us know what you'd like us to cover next. We'll cover any video that you want, so let us know what would be the most helpful for you. Best of luck for your exams, everyone. I hope you get some nice questions and that your late night studying isn't too stressful. Alright, we'll see you next time for more Big Brain Energy.